we're looking forward to possibly having a new working group that will bring together people from multiple issue committees to address feminist foreign policy. Because after all, feminist foreign policy involves issues that are represented through our many different issue committees. So, Odile, I believe that you are the person to come on now. Please unmute yourself.
Hello. This was really a wonderful presentation on Cuba. The speakers were just great. So it was very inspiring. My name is Odile Hugonot-Haber, and I am part of the Ann Arbor Ypsilanti branch, and this is an introduction to a feminist foreign policy. I was first introduced to the idea of a feminist foreign policy in a feminist forum in Paris during the COP21. This is called the Conference of Parties for Climate Change, and it happened in November, December 2015. Then I was invited in San Francisco by the Peace Development Fund to a meeting with WILPF US and the women who crossed the North-South Korean border. There, we were introduced to the concept of the Swedish feminist foreign policy. It was initiated by Sweden in 2014 as a foreign policy with a gender perspective to promote gender equality and human rights. Very interesting. Since that time, I found out that there were 5 countries that so far have adopted, in part only, what they call a feminist foreign policy: Sweden, France, Canada, New Zealand, and Mexico. Given the state of the foreign policy in the United States and in the world, there is much to do to change the foreign policy. And it is crucial that we do so. So many lives depend on it, and probably even our survival as a species on Earth. Money going to armament and war must be moved to climate change so we can face all the disaster that our neglect of nature and lack of support for life have brought us to. Today, I am happy to introduce Dr. Patricia Hynes, who has a video for us highlighting this new concept. Pat Hynes is a retired environmental engineer and professor of environmental health who work on multiracial and low-income issues of the urban environment. She also is working on environmental justice, which was very strong at the University of Michigan, and feminism at the Boston University of Public Health. Pat has authored and edited 7 books. Pat was also the former Trap Rock director from 2010 to 2020. It is a center for peace and justice in Western Massachusetts. There, she is committed to build an educational center in peacemaking and peace leadership for activists, educators, and students. We hope that we will have a strong working group coming out of this workshop, presented by the Ann Arbor Ypsilanti branch with the assistance and direction of Pat Hynes, Nancy Price, and Tura Campanella-Cook, and as well as the technical assistance of Laura Dewey. We will have questions after the introduction and video. Please write your question in the chat, making sure that you put the word question at first, and then you can put it in all caps, so we know it is a question. Do not make it too long, so we can have a good conversation. enjoy this workshop. Thank you. Now there is Pat Hynes who is going to present her video.
One moment, please, while we figure out our technical issues here.
Nice to see you, Pat.
Thank you. Thank you, Odile. It's nice to see you. I think that whoever is doing the tech will put the video on, but let me just say that I am so impressed by the conference today. And the Cuba presentation was excellent, just wonderful, very hopeful. And I also, of course, Vandana Shiva, she's a friend, was wonderful. But the entire day and the commitment of WILPF Women is just so evident in these workshops.
We are passionate for peace and justice.
The passion for peace and justice, it is so evident.
And
it makes me very happy to be, I'm a more recent member of WILPF, maybe just 4 or 5 years, but I attended the 2018 conference in Ghana and as a delegate, but the first day, which was the African Women's Feminist Peace Conference, was one of the finest days of conference that I have ever, and I've attended so many, dozens, finest days. And I have a few things to say from that conference once the video is finished and we have some questions, etc.
The video is now ready to be presented.
Great.
Thank you.
Go right ahead, Laura.
These statements convey the woman-identified spirit and reality that must infuse feminist foreign policy. I am not free when any woman is free, even when her shackles are very different from mine. Audre Lorde. Poverty, discrimination, and violence are still strongly present in the lives of women and girls. Underrepresentation in power and decision-making is still the norm. Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, Under Secretary General and UN Women Executive Director. Women belong in all places where decisions are being made. Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I can't believe that we are in the 21st century and we are still fighting for gender equality. We have to smash patriarchy. Racha Hafar, founder and president of Not for Trade, the first anti-trafficking NGO in Tunisia. What would comprise the content of US feminist foreign policy? Our starting point is the situation today of women in the US and worldwide regarding our freedom, power, and equality. Here is a brief but incomplete snapshot. The 25th anniversary of the 1995 Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action was commemorated in Paris between June 30th and July 2nd, 2021. Entitled Generation Equality Forum, it carried a heavy message. Quote, "It is disheartening that still not one country can claim to have achieved gender equality." End quote. Moreover, quote, "The COVID-19 pandemic has been a serious setback for gender equality and women's health. Poverty, discrimination, and violence are still strongly present in the lives of women and girls. Underrepresentation in power and decision-making is still the norm. Consider the following data-based findings and comparisons on the status of women and girls presented at the Generation Equality Forum, all being departure points for feminist foreign policy. On women in politics across the world, only 1 in 4 seats in national parliaments are held by women. Yet this is more than double the proportion in 1995. Women gained 30% of parliamentary seats in 2019, in countries with quotas compared to 18% in countries without quotas. Ironically, the United States, touting itself as a beacon of democracy, required a quota of 25% women in the legislatures of countries in which it waged war, Afghanistan and Iraq. Yet the US languishes at just 24% women in its own Senate, and only very recently achieved 27% in the House of Representatives after decades of paltry women's representation. Further, today's Senate is a majority elderly white men in a country of 40% non-white. Despite progress throughout the world, women throughout the world are also largely excluded from other political arenas, policies, and budgets. In only 14 countries are 50% or more of cabinet members women. In 80% of countries with national plans to achieve gender equality, only 1/3 are costed out and financially resourced. And perhaps the biggest obstacle for women's political equality is bias against women in power. A large share of women and men globally, it's 43% women and 53% of men respondents believe men make better leaders, according to Generation Equality Forum. On financial and economic inequality, on average, women are paid 16% less than men. Only 1 in 4 managers are women. Women aged 25 to 34 are 25% more likely to live in extreme poverty than men. Women on average do 3 times as much unpaid care and domestic work as men, with long-term consequences for their economic and social security in older age. 31% of young women aged 15 to 24 are not in education, employment, or training, more than double the rate of young men, which is 14%. On sexual and physical violence against women and girls, 18% of ever partnered women ages 15 to 19 experienced sexual and or physical violence by an intimate partner in the previous 12 months. That's the year is 2019. The rate of physical and sexual violence is higher across a lifetime, 1 in 3 women. Violence against women increased across the world when women were restricted to their homes with violent male partners because of COVID. 34% of adolescent girls aged 15 to 19 have undergone female genital mutilation in 31 countries. While this has dropped from 47% incidence 25 years ago, it is a tragically high rate of violence against girls that carries pain, serious health risks, and lasting messages of male dominance. On reproductive access, freedom, and health. In 2019, 190 million women of reproductive age worldwide who wanted to avoid pregnancy did not use any contraceptive method. We can only infer the reasons. Contraceptives not available, not affordable, or forbidden by an intimate partner, culture, or religion. In sub-Saharan Africa, 3 in 5 new HIV infections are among 15 to 19-year-old girls. As a guide to framing US feminist foreign policy, let us consider the 4 main US foreign policy goals as articulated by the State Department. First, protect the United States and Americans. So that is security at home as well as abroad. Advance democracy, human rights, and other global interests. Promote international understanding of American values and policies, and support US diplomats, government officials, and all other personnel at home and abroad who make these goals a reality. So that is the State Department's 4 main goals as published on their site. So US feminist foreign policy modeled on these goals would include the following: assure that women are secure from all inequalities in society, including personal, that is freedom from violence, sexual and reproductive health freedom, and political, economic in both the cash and care economies, and educational. Assure that women are secure in all of these domains. Inequality in these realms is the most serious threat to national security for women in our country and throughout the world. Advance democracy and human rights for women in all policy negotiations, agreements, aid, and treaties with other countries, the UN and international organizations. This is a feminist foreign policy goal for the US, with data-based evaluations built in so as to document advances in women's equality. Third, promote international understanding of values and policies based on the equality of women and an end to violence against women everywhere in all forms. Use all international forums and country-to-country meetings to promote and advance women's rights. Fourth, assure that at least 1/2 of US diplomats, government officials, and all related personnel are women who mirror our country's diversity and who are committed to the equality of women at home and abroad. In other words, no token positions. Women must be equally represented in leadership positions in all government agencies. This would be a feminist foreign policy goal. With both commitment to and progress towards these goals, our chances of achieving authentic democracy for all, women equally with men, both in the United States and in our relationships with other countries, of building toward peace here and in our relationships with other countries, and of reversing our acceleration towards environmental degradation. Our chances of achieving all of these are heightened with progress in terms of women's equality. Recent groundbreaking analysis validates this conviction. A team of researchers, including security studies experts and statisticians, has created the largest global database on the status of women. It's called Women's Stats, one word. And they compared the security and level of conflict within 175 countries to the overall security of women in those countries.
Pat, have you accidentally muted yourself? Or Laura?
It was Laura. And it's my bad. I apologize. It was me that did it.
Can you put her back? We'll resume the video momentarily. As everyone may have noticed, this is a volunteer-run operation, and sometimes we make a few technical mistakes. But we are looking forward to resuming the video momentarily. Is Laura still with us?
Laura is going to run it back a couple of minutes, and she will be with us in just a second.
Thank you.
Discriminating for global security, world peace, and feminist foreign policy.
Is that enough of a backup? I don't know when I lost my sound.
That's fine. Just go ahead.
Okay.
The degree of equality of women within countries predicts best, better than degree of democracy, better than level of wealth, income inequality, or ethno-religious identity, how peaceful or conflict-ridden your countries are. Further, democracies with higher levels of violence against women are less stable and are more likely to choose force rather than diplomacy to resolve conflict. Violence against women in its multifarious forms is an invisible, unstable foundation underlying local, national, and international politics and security. Dr. Valerie Hudson framed the team's central study, finding prospectively, quote, increasing gender equality is expected to have cascading effects on security, stability, and resilience within a country and internationally. What are the universal indicators that manifest the equality and inequality of women in a country as compiled by Women's Stats? On a personal level, they comprise the numerous forms of violence against women: sexual, sex trafficking and prostitution, genital mutilation, sex-selective abortion, female infanticide, neglect of girls because of son preference, and preventable maternal morbidity. Personal and family status law further adds to women's and girls' inequality and mortality. When women cannot divorce, are impoverished by divorce, or stay in stultifying and violent relationships to avoid destitution. When girls are forced into child marriage, they face the grave risk of complications from pregnancy and childbirth, which is the major cause of death globally for teenage girls aged 15 to 19. A feminist foreign policy would address child marriage traditions and condition foreign aid and trade on eliminating these. Inheritance and property laws that deprive a woman of resources comparable to those inherited by their brothers and husbands ultimately impoverish women and is a form of economic violence. Because women's reproduction and care for children and extended family, known as the care economy, because this is not compensated, women are cheated of savings, pension, and social security. Consequently, the greatest risk factor for being poor in old age is having been a mother, according to Women's Stats researchers. Feminist foreign policy would make freedom from economic violence for women a goal of foreign policy, particularly in our aid agreements with other countries. At the structural level of governance, currently only 22 out of 193 countries have a female head of state or government, a mere 11% versus 89% male international leaders. And despite its narcissistic identity as exceptional and necessary for the world, the US has never elected a woman president. No doubt, the paucity of women in US government is correlated with the US dismal rating on the 2020 Global Peace Index. We were rated at 122 out of 160 countries ranked. Studies of women in leadership in public and private sectors have concluded that women in high-level positions and on boards deal more effectively with risk, focus more strategically on long-term priorities, and are more successful financially. Experimental studies of women and men negotiating post-conflict agreements have found that all male groups all male groups take riskier, less empathic, and more aggressive positions. They also break down more quickly than negotiations that include women. Further, men are more satisfied with decisions made with women involved than with all male groups. And yet, despite these findings, 70% of climate negotiators and almost all peace negotiators are men, according to the recent Generation Equality report. WILPF member Ayo Ayula Amale, a Nigerian lawyer and mediator, underscored the crucial potential and impact of women in peace negotiations. Research has shown, she told me, that's where women's inclusion is prioritized, peace is more probable, especially when women are in a position to influence decision-making. The reasons for this are not far-fetched. Women constantly bridge boundaries and build alliances for peace. They promote dialogue and build trust. Women take an inclusive approach, whether it is stopping conflict, contributing to peace processes, or building their societies after conflict or war. It is impossible to talk about feminist foreign policy for the United States without confronting the juggernaut of US militarism. The United States is the only country to have a military command on every continent, 800 military bases throughout the world, and active duty military personnel in some 150 countries. We have a war budget equal to 38% of the entire world's war budget, and are the largest weapons maker and seller in the world, selling American military hardware to 96 countries, with almost half going to the Middle East, and unbelievably, 24% to Saudi Arabia alone. Our discretionary budget for war and militarized national security is greater than the sum of allocated funding for genuine domestic security, including agriculture, infrastructure, housing, workplace safety, sustainable energy, environmental protection, and so on. It is de rigueur for US presidents, Democrat and Republican, to brag about our military potency. Quote, the greatest military the world has ever seen, second to none, implying that military prowess is our greatest asset and to be maintained at all cost. Feminist foreign policy would require a Department of Peace, funded by reducing the entire military budget in half to assure that our efforts for peace match our military efforts. After all, recent public policy research at Harvard University demonstrates that nonviolent resistance is 3 times more effective than violent resistance in organizing and protesting repressive governments. Feminist foreign policy would redefine national greatness by its diplomacy and cooperative agreements with countries based on partnering on climate, pandemics, biodiversity, aid for humanitarian purposes, and exchange among scientists, artists, athletes, and yes, astute diplomacy to avoid militarized conflicts. Clearly, an authentic feminist foreign policy for the United States, or call it a national action plan on women, peace, and security, which we do have since 2011, would require US disarmament. So a authentic feminist foreign policy for our country would require US disarmament. Our country, I say meaning US, because this is an international conference. Ending our wars and occupations, ending our military presence in 800 bases, and special operations in 70% of the countries throughout the world, and investing in a Department of Peace to implement feminist foreign policy. Improving the status of women country by country through non-military aid and trade agreements would be at the heart of feminist foreign policy. This, according to empirical analysis, women's stats being one aspect of it, and there are other studies like theirs as well, this would bring the world closer to peace. My special thanks to Nancy Price, who conceived this forum on feminist foreign policy. I admire her convictions and tenacity, her very strong feminism, and to WILPF International for your presence and good work in the world. Thank you. These statements convey the woman-identified spirit and reality that must.
Thank you so much. And do we have further moderation? Odile, Patricia?
If anyone wants to put any question in the chat or voice them, question or statement, please do so.
And Odile, I have a few final points, they're not very long, to make to add to the feminist foreign policy. I could either do it now, or I could do it at the last 5 minutes, let's say, of the session, whichever you think would be a good time to do it.
I suggest we do it now so that people have a chance.
That's what I was going to say. It's probably better to do it now.
Fine.
And then people will have time to think about their questions.
Yes, thank you. First, I had mentioned in the video that I made a 2011 National Action Plan on Women, Women, Peace, and Security. And it was under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton that the United States developed this, as did many other countries. The US State Department released this National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, as I said, in 2011. It was championed by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. It brings the United States into compliance with UN resolutions that call for integrating women as full partners in conflict resolution and peace building. That's UN Resolution 1325, I think, which many are familiar with, and then there have been subsequent ones. Its purpose is to assure that US diplomatic defense and development policies are gauged in part by their impact on women in countries where we engage diplomatically, militarily, and economically. One example of implementing this plan would be to, quote, strengthen protection for women and girls in conflict situations with greater focus on greater legal accountability for rape and sexual violence. Tragically, our diplomatic and defense policies in Iraq, and I choose Iraq, but this is true of many other countries as well, where we have waged war, been involved in conflict. Tragically, our diplomatic and defense policies in Iraq created the opposite of what the intention of this National Action Plan for Women's Peace Security. Conditions were up to, this is in Iraq, 2 million widows are penniless. Legions of women were killed by fundamentalist squads in Basra. Thousands have ended up in prostitution, and Sharia law holding in part that women are legally 1/2 worth men and socially 1/4 of what men are worth. That is embedded within the new constitution, a potential setback for 50 years. The same war has left tens of thousands of American women, soldiers, broken physically, mentally, and spiritually from military sexual trauma, instigated by fellow soldiers, having the fortitude to acknowledge publicly that women are the biggest losers in our vainglorious militaristic policies in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, would give substance and integrity to the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. The other problem I have with these national action plans and 1325 and subsequent UN resolutions is that they bring women in to resolve conflict. Often when the war has gone on too long and they have to figure out a way to end it. And they bring women in to assure band-aids, you might say, that protect women from the worst of sexual violence in war, where the problem is the war itself. A second point I want to make, and this comes from Nozizwe Madlala Routledge, who spoke. She's a South African. She was in the first ANC government, post-apartheid government, and she spoke at the 2018 WILPF African Women's Feminist Peace Conference. I interviewed her. Okay, I'm not sure what happened here.
We do have questions, so.
Okay, I'll finish with this point, which is, she said that the end of minority white rule, she told me, did not end patriarchal militarized rule. You enter office to change government and government changes you. Being elected to government is not enough. And I had spoken about having equal percentage of women in government, but being elected to government is not enough, she said. Women and men of integrity must transform government.
Right.
May I suggest that we just go ahead with the questions?
Yes, go ahead with the questions.
Oh, I'm not pulling them in order, but I'll start with this one. Did the slides reflect the fact that the US is making all of these principles for other countries, while internally we seem to make little or no progress with our own, feminist equality? Can you speak to that? And yes, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that what the latter part of the slides do is to present the ideal of the feminist foreign policy. We do not have it with the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton devised and promoted as a member of the UN, and to endorse 1325 and any subsequent conventions or treaties. So what I presented was the ideal of a feminist foreign policy. It is not far off from the best feminist foreign policy, which is Sweden's. I reviewed Sweden's documents, and I saw that both within the country as well as at large in the world, that these were principles that they were propounding, and also called themselves as a country a feminist country, which makes it possible to have the kind of ideal foreign feminist policy that they have. So it's not unlike theirs, except they did not have to address the issue of engagement in war because Sweden doesn't. I do want to point out, though, some contradictions with Sweden. They are the 6th largest manufacturer of weapons of war. Secondly, I learned, and this was basically looking up their fidelity to their foreign policy. I learned that essentially a contradiction in their feminist foreign policy, in that Sweden voted in 2017 in the UN for the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So it was voted in by 122 countries. Then it needed to be ratified by 50 countries, which happened by January 2021. However, Sweden did not vote to ratify it, in other words, so that it would be a law in their own country. They supported it being passed in 2017 with 121 other countries, there was no explanation for it. It sort of got very vague as I looked it up in terms of what the rationale behind that was. We can only guess that they had a lot of pressure from the US and NATO to stay away from ratifying it. So does that answer your question?
I'm reading questions from the chat, so.
Okay.
Odile, would you like to speak to questions of the characteristics of the feminist foreign policies in the other 5 countries?
Well, they started having a part of the government, but Mexico is one of the countries, and we know that the murder rate of women is very, very high in Mexico. So, you know, France also did, and France still has a lot of battering of women. So, you know, it's, I think they're trying to create something following what Sweden has done, but I don't see right now that they have established a very strong infrastructure for feminist policy. So we have to pressure them. And I know WILPF International is very upward and forward about doing that. And I hope WILPF US will follow up. Regina Burcham did give us a question, and she's very critical about it. Like she says, you know, yes, Hillary Clinton is supporting a feminist policy, but she's also supporting wars. So, you know, you have to, people have different definition of what a feminist policy is. Anyway, I don't want to make a conference on this. I'll stop there. There is another question and we should read it. Can you, Tura?
I think it was answered in the chat. Someone asked what the 5 countries were, and they have been listed. I am not seeing.
I said Barbara Nielsen had a question also.
Right. New Zealand, Mexico, Sweden, Canada, and France are the 5 countries. Here I am answering. I'm reading from the chat.
Yeah, I wrote that first in the chat and somebody made it bigger.
Right. There is a question, and I'm not sure. I think, Pat, you've already spoken to it, but it's the question also from Barbara Nielsen about what about references to our international WILPF policies and the many statements on feminist foreign policy considerations. Have you already answered that, Pat?
In other words, she's asking about current, is Barbara there? Are you asking about current international WILPF feminist foreign policy statements and principles existing? I think that may be what she
that is what she's asking about. Can you address that?
Is Nancy Price here on the program? I'm thinking that she may be able to answer that better. As I mentioned earlier, that I have been involved in WILPF for perhaps 4 years, and so am less familiar with international policy, except for my presence at the 2018 conference.
Well, I will say that Ray Atcherson has done a lot on feminist foreign policy in terms of nuclear weapons, and she just wrote a book about it. I haven't read her book, so I cannot speak about it.
Yes.
And I just saw Nancy Price coming up somewhere.
Yes, Nancy, you can unmute yourself.
I was trying to, but you had, okay, here I am. Well, frankly speaking, I have been considering this topic in terms of what we hear in the US section and in regards to our own hyper militarism, hyper imperialism, and spending, 53 cents on the dollar on all the material of war. I've been thinking of how do we create not only this, but how do we create this working group that we're proposing to discuss, organizing some way of beginning to articulate this topic in a more, within WILPF US and in a more popular way as we work on the Move the Money campaign, or we are within working in our own campaigns, sort of articulate some of the issues and the statistics that Pat was illuminating. I have not really examined, to my satisfaction, International's documents or have read Ray's book. But of course, as you heard from Pat, her exposition of this goes much more beyond the sort of nuclear topic, mm-hmm. and into the fundamentals of how do we achieve equity and peace and freedom in general as we develop our strategies within the US. So that would be my the way I would handle this as an answer at this moment. I think when we form this working group and really develop a sort of conversation about how can we move this forward, that's when I think we could expand this and consider what, answering Barbara's question, informing ourselves better and developing some kind of strategy and tactics and materials. So thank you all for being on this, attending this and listening. And thank you, Pat and Odile and Tura.
Robin Lloyd just put something in the chat that we should read. Maybe Tura can read it.
Well, there's no need to read the chat aloud, but there was one more question. The question was, is there any commentary from the feminist foreign policy world on the rights of lesbian women or trans women?
I haven't, in my research, I haven't found anything on this, mm-hmm. so far.
Mm-hmm. I think my response would be that comes under the umbrella of the equality of women, and the personal equality of women in particular, more so than economic or political. But that would certainly come under if we are calling for equality of women, and then break it out into the dimensions of that. That would certainly, sexual choice, it could come that way.
And also the issue of violence against women.
Yes, yes. And I'll just say that I am aware of the great work that WILPF and Ray Atchison did with regard to participating in ICANN, which was so responsible for the prohibition of nuclear weapons at this point as a treaty and convention of the UN. But as was said this morning, Vandana Shiva particularly, I think this feminist foreign policy would gather under one large umbrella the specific issues that can sometimes get sort of siloed in terms of world peace, women's security, et cetera. I mean, nuclear weapons is a major part of it, but so also is climate, so also is food security, so also is violence against women, political equality of women, economic equality. So it would be I would expect international WILPF policy, US policy, to sort of frame it as very holistic while being specific about what each of those issues is.
It could be a large field, but we could get a lot of women interested in participating in foreign policy, which is not really the fact right now in terms of grassroots. Mm-hmm. So that would give us a chance to develop this issue and to create more pressure onto politicians to move forward with a women's agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much to the panel We do need to wrap up now. Do you have any closing words?
Well, I will let Patricia say something, but I just want people to reach out to Nancy or to me with our email if you want to be in the working group. So please reach out to us. Thank you. Or to Tura, one of the three of us. And Patricia, go ahead, closing word.
Yeah, yes, I do. I think what's so important about WILPF is the feminist focus. There are so many social movements in this country. I work in peace and justice, directed a center, and then link with many other groups in this country. And what is a regular disappointment for me is that I do not see a consciousness of women's equality as central enough. In fact, it's almost absent in many of these organizations. And yet the analysis I spoke about earlier by Woman Stats, the statistical analysis shows that where women's equality is increased and achieved, you have a more peaceful and secure country and situation within the country and then in relationships with the world. Yeah. So I have great respect for WILPF. And the African WILPF in particular, they articulated it so strongly the first day of the 2018 International Conference in Ghana.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for everyone who worked and participated. I hope we will continue work in the Ann Arbor Ypsilanti branch, but as well in WILPF National in US, so we can make some headway towards this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you.